Over the past few months, the United States has been torn by divisions over the coronavirus and police accountability. When it comes to climate change, a new report by the Sustainable Solutions Lab at UMass Boston and local foundations shows a good deal of agreement, along with some differences. To tell us about the findings are two of the authors from UMass, an assistant professor of public health in the School for the Environment, Lorena Estrada-Martínez, and a professor of political science and director of the Institute for Asian American Studies, Paul Watanabe. I'd like to thank you both very much for being with us. I want to start with Paul, because a lot of our viewers, maybe they have not heard of the Sustainable Solutions Lab, but the lab has a mission, and I think that has a lot to do with the design of this report. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Thank you very much, Chris, for having us on. Yes, the Sustainable Solutions Lab is a response to what a lot of universities are attempting to respond to, and that's the changes in climate and global warming and what it means in terms of policy and so forth. But the Sustainable Solutions Lab, which is UMass Boston's responses, took a particular strategic turn a few years ago, and that was to center its work on the underserved populations, the populations that are hit most importantly by the impact of climate change in a disparate fashion: racial minorities, communities that are low income, and so forth. So it took a particular focus on these issues. And that work has been supported in part of its strategic plan by the Barr Foundation. And one of the decisions that we made early on, if we're going to focus on communities of color, we want to know where communities of color stand on these issues to begin as a baseline view, because we hear so much about people saying what the communities of color might or might not think about climate change and these issues, but we thought it was important to ask them. And so we got the support of the Hyams Foundation to actually construct a survey, probably the most comprehensive survey ever done in the Boston area, where we got the views of the four principal racial groups: Asian Americans, Blacks and African Americans, Latinos, and whites, in large enough numbers to create that baseline sort of piece of evidence. And that's what we did with this survey. And that's what I think is, at the beginning, the most significant piece of the work we did. We went to the people whose views that matter and asked them about what they felt about these issues, something that had been not done on this scale ever before.
Right. Lorena, what does that mean going down the line, making those populations have a place at the table, having their voices heard on policy?
Well, I think it's incredibly important for our voices, and I include myself in it, to be at the table. I think that before, we didn't really know. I think most of the studies that had been done up to date, not just in Boston and Massachusetts, but at the national level, had really been only including the voices and the experiences of the white population. They would do sampling, and we call it generally the general population, but it's really only covering the white population, right? People of color, we tend to concentrate in certain areas, right? Geographic areas. We're not equally distributed across all of Massachusetts. So it was really, really important to go and sort of hone into specific areas of the state. And in doing so, then we're able to provide a lot more context and tell policymakers in those areas exactly what it is that people of color perceive to be the problem and what are specific policies they are in favor of, right? Exactly what it is that they are overwhelmingly in favor, or what are the things that they might see with suspicion or think that they are not good ideas and good policies to support. That was a really big, important piece of this particular study.
When I look at some of the metrics from these different racial groups, and I think especially among the Asian Americans, I was thinking this is also about maybe living in Quincy and knowing how flood prone a community can be.
Well, that's the point, is that we actually wanted to bring the experiences of people who were in the areas that were most affected. And we chose the Boston area and communities like Quincy, Revere, Lynn, areas that are impacted by, potentially impacted by these, and have large, as Lorena points out, large populations and non-white populations. And that's how we were able to construct our sample and get this information. And we did see, as you point out, Chris, lots of areas where there's some divergence between various communities of color and between whites and non-whites, and lots of areas of convergence. But the point is that we only speculated about these areas of convergence and divergence before. And now we have some hard evidence to build upon to answer some of these questions. Do they both think that climate change is a serious problem? Do they think its sources are the same? Do they think it's a serious problem that can be solved? We now have some evidence to indicate if there are areas in which there's general agreement or disagreement, and we saw both.
Lorena, what about some of the disagreements? There is a lot of consensus that climate change is a serious problem, even about public intervention maybe, but what about the disagreement over causes? Because there is a pattern there that you detected.
You know, that was one of the more interesting pieces of the study. I think that we, by and large, there's been a lot of consensus that climate change is really due to human activity. But we found that for Black and Black Americans and for Latinos, there was a lot more consensus that it was due to both human activities and natural changes in the environment. And that was something that surprised us. And then that was sort of contrary to Asian Americans and whites who were in agreement that it was due only to human activities. And so that was one of the pieces that really was striking to us. Another place that was also striking was their perceptions on who was going to be affected by climate change. Again, here, white populations were equally likely to think that they were going to be populations that were going to have an equal burden when it came to the effects of climate changes, to the consequences of climate change. But all of the groups, all of the communities of color thought that there were going to be much more equal effects of climate change. And that was also really striking. I think that contrary to our original hypothesis, we thought that going in, that communities of color were more likely to think that there was going to be an unequal impact. And we actually found exactly the opposite in our report.
I want to turn to Paul Watanabe. I mean, how do you translate that? Because, you know, on the one hand, it seems paradoxical that populations we think might be more vulnerable to climate change see it as really affecting everyone equally. And whereas white people, at least they have a larger minority of them who think, well, this is some people's problem more than ours. What does that mean politically?
Well, it means a number of different things, and lots of these surprising findings raise a lot of questions, both politically and how we respond to them in policy terms. And that's the importance of having this baseline study. As we point out, our process was going to be to have this survey, but only as a beginning point, and then to have focus group conversations within the community to ask them what is behind these sorts of responses to a survey. A survey only gives you a little snapshot. It doesn't provide a lot of detail what's behind the responses. And we wanted to know what was behind the responses by going to members of the community themselves in focus groups. And our intention was to do this, and then the COVID-19 crisis hit, and we had to sort of put aside this focus group medium that we were going to use to augment the findings of the survey. So we make it very clear, we decided to go forth with the results of the survey first, but we're still going to pursue, when we're able to, this focus group strategy to exactly do what you suggest, Chris, to find out what's behind some of these answers, to find out behind the differences that were explained, for example, about the causes of climate changes. Why is it that Black and Latino communities are more inclined to say it was both from natural causes and from human activity than were their Asian Americans and whites? This is what we would be able to get a lot more deeply if we had these conversations with the communities themselves. And that's the other thing that we hope that our survey will spur some of these conversations and these inquiry, but not end it, but really spur these discussions.
Lorena, what about the differences with regard to preparations for a severe weather event or a need to evacuate? What did you find?
No, that's actually one of the really big red flags that we have in our area. There are stark differences, stark racial differences when it comes to how different groups are prepared to withstand a major crisis, whether climate-related crisis. For example, about 75% of white residents that we interviewed, that we responded to the survey, said that they had home or renter's insurance, right, in case of an emergency. But that went down to by about 25%. For Black and Latinos. And so that was a huge contrast there. less than 50% of Asians and Blacks have an evacuation plan, right? So there's huge differences in terms of how prepared communities of color and people of color are able to withstand the different problems that might come along when there's a major, major crisis in our area. And that's something that politicians and different groups and policymakers really need to take a close look when it comes to preparation in our area and how they respond in different communities and different neighborhoods.
Finally, yes, please, go ahead, Paul.
I just wanted to pick up on Lorena's point. This is an area where there's some clear distinctions that are made in terms of preparation. And this is something where the policy establishment and governmental responses can be very clear about it. When we see this tendency by non-white populations to indicate, for example, their level of insurance is significantly lower than that of white populations, their ability to provide food and medical and have medical supplies available is considered much less by them than white populations. These sorts of responses can get policy responses by the government and others that can be built around them right now. It seems to me that these disparities should be a part of our planning and our preparation and how we go forward. These are straightforward assessments of their own ability to respond to any climate change impacts. And I think that these have immediate policy implications, I think, in terms of the jurisdictions that are concerned about these communities.
Well, thank you both very much for joining us. And I know this sounds like almost just the tip of the iceberg, but we'll certainly look forward to some sequels on this as well. And we'd like to thank you both for taking the time. Paul Watanabe and Lorena Estrada-Martínez from UMass Boston. We'll have more news.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Chris. Appreciate it.
Thank you. We'll have more news in just a moment.